All right, my name is Rohan Patankar. Today I'm going to speak to you about some of my work and my trajectory over the past few years, and how a lot of it comes back to thinking about being and working on the edge of architecture. And I'll walk you through these slides and tell you what I mean. Oop, great. So I graduated from architecture school in 2013. I went to SPA in Delhi. And then after about 4 years of practice in the field, I recently finished my master's at the LSE. I did the MSc Cities program. But all of this while, I found myself always curious about what was happening outside of the studio. So starting from the first year, every summer I would find myself doing internships with, say, a product designer, a conservation architect, a public artist, again, an architecture practice, but also some self-initiated work that I started from probably the third year. And that sort of seemed to be this constant recurring theme during college and even afterward. At work, though, I also tried a bunch of things and I was still figuring out what was interesting or meaningful for me. I started with an architecture practice, which also did research work. Then I worked at a proper sort of building and interiors practice for a year. Then I worked with a nonprofit doing urban design work. And finally, at an urban strategy and planning practice. I should also tell you that these are quite a few jobs to switch between 3.5, 4 years. I also got thrown out of a job once. And this is only to tell you that at any point that this happens, it's all right. And life goes on. At the same time, a lot of self-initiated work and volunteering continued over the years, even as I was practicing at architecture and urban practices. So as I was prepping for this presentation, I dug up this old application that I'd sent out to become a curator, like a student curator for a residency in 2013. And already there, I found several starting points to what my practice has sort of grown to become. I write that during projects at school and elsewhere, I found myself enjoying the position of being inside a situation and at the fringes simultaneously. And at the same time, I write that I would want to work with artists to bring out discourse that is larger than the sum of its parts. And this was interesting to me to see how badly I'd articulated some of this also in 2013, but how it's only taken several years for me to understand it and for it to come out more clearly. So what I'm going to do is now walk you through 4 projects and talk about 4 broad lessons that I think I've drawn from them. So the first project that I'm going to talk to you about is this apprenticeship I did with Asim Waqif, who's an architect and artist. He taught me in my first year and has done since some really interesting sculptural work over the years. I was brought on board to assist him for the production of the project, and I worked with 3 other colleagues of mine from SPA. And this project was really interesting because it took us really in the summer to Badrinath. So Badrinath is a special town in the north of India. It's a pilgrim temple town which sees many, many more tourists every summer. They come and with them they bring lots of trash, things that they use and throw away, usually into the river, or it just gets gathered together in mountains and burnt out. What's even more surprising is that it's got these old streams called dharas, one of which you can see here with the face of the cow. These dharas were meant to have not just drinkable water, but also water with medicinal properties. Most of these dharas, there were 5 or 7 that we spotted there, also were meant to have had been mentioned in the Puranas, so they had religious significance to the people there. But often, most of the tourists and pilgrims that came there had no idea that they could really be drinking water that was naturally available for free, but would end up often just buying bottled water from there and sort of throwing away all of that garbage. So the genesis of the project was to think about how to We missed a slide, yes. So the project really started to think about how we could engage public art or use public art to engage the publics in a conversation about this local water. And that's why to the urbane audience, we started with the idea of Swachh Peyajal, which is clean water or clean drinking water. What we did was we said we would do signage at each of these water points, and we would write out the mythological story of the water and where it came from, etc. So this is some of the signage in action. Yeah. Right. And along with that, we also did some directional signage in different parts of the town. And finally, we also did this really clever sort of repackaging sticker. So basically, if anyone came back to us with an empty bottle of water, we could fill it with water from this stream. And it had like scientific tests that we'd done from the water. So it had all of its scientific value, but also sort of using the same language that typical mineral water bottles use to repurpose that and use it, but give the water away for free. So we'd also gotten like this stall where we'd sort of talked about this, and we were giving away free water to all the pilgrims that were lined up for hours together. So the big lesson I think this project gave me was I was still in my third year, and it made me realize that architecture could give us so many other skills that could be applied outside of formal architecture practice even. While we do everyday work in architecture school, we make conversation, we're always sense making between local and global systems, we do spatial analysis, but we're also sort of conveying that information back to people. So all of these skills could be leveraged or utilized in several other places and not just in building buildings. And I thought that was quite meaningful to know back then. It was also liberating to find that someone who had studied under, who was also an architect, was finally not practicing architecture at all, and it kind of helped me ease the pressure a little bit. Can't see two. Yes, okay, cool. Now I'll talk about Delhi Dally, which was a project that I started in my third year of architecture school. And it really started because for our annual festival, which is called Utopia, our classmates felt like there was not enough or not any intellectual programming. So they came to us and said, why don't we put together a talk? And then Varun and Bhavika, my friends, said we could talk about the image of Delhi. And we got a historian, another architect, and a public activist together, and we put together a talk. And really it was about how we perceived the city differently. And from there, Delhi Dallying became a blog. We would write about places that we would go to, rather infrequently, but we did. Yeah, we just enjoyed sort of talking about how we started to learn to see the city, but talk about it in ways that were really simple or easy to consume for people. So another step towards that was to do this poster series where we literally bullied our classmates to photograph for this, and we literally collaged their pictures with other Delhi sort of objects like the samosa or the palitika or the genda phool. And at the same time, we also bullied our teachers to sort of engage in this sort of poster series. So we did fun stuff like that. And then it got a little bit more interesting, where in my final year, this was a group seminar project. And we were trying to, so we were assigned the task to go into Shahjahanabad, which is Old Delhi, and to understand it. And to understand it because either it feels too simple or everyday, and that's why completely unworthy of attention, or it feels extremely chaotic and unorganized, and so completely hopeless. So we use the lens of complex adaptive systems and common property regimes to understand how individuals are really taking decisions that are in their interest, and patterns emerge when you start looking at these neighborhoods with slightly more patience. And the whole intention was to keep going there every day. So one part of the research was to do all of this secondary sort of reading and writing around complex adaptive systems and all of this theory. But at the same time, every Saturday we found ourselves going back to Old Delhi and researching like mohallas in Delhi, which were self-organized neighborhoods, and we were trying to understand how they'd evolved over the years in time, and what keeps them alive or kicking even today. So these were three neighborhoods that we looked at, along with sort of speaking with people every day, understanding where they came from and what the social dynamic was. We also did spatial analysis where we would look at the plans or entry and find out what the open spaces were, who was getting access to it, how are they getting it, and how over the years it was changing and evolving little by little. Some of that also got converted into diagrams such as this, where we were able to comparatively sort of analyze these three mohallas and say this is how the street connects to the main courtyard, and then there's an inner courtyard, and then different sort of people based on their familial relationships have different access points to these open spaces. And really the point was then to say work like this can help us not decomplexify, but at least understand the complexity a little bit better. But at the same time, while the report came together, it was a good project. We felt like there was no way in which we could talk to our mothers about it in this sort of language, and that's when we said, like, why don't we put together a walking tour where we talk about just the same kind of stuff, but actually show and tell and walk people through some of this. And that's where really the idea of the walking tours came together. Soon after, we found ourselves doing other walking tours in Old Delhi. This one was around markets, also in Delhi, where we talk about the many layers of the city and how they come together to make our experience of the city. So they weren't really heritage tours, but they were tours around contemporary culture and how that gets shaped sort of simultaneously or concurrently. This one was a walking tour we did in collaboration with the first street art festival in India. This was in Shahpur. And finally, this kind of led to the genesis of the Delhi Walk Festival, where these people came to us and said, there's a certain way in which you look at the city. Why don't you curate this festival where we could get several other people who do walking tours to come together and really for 2 weeks celebrate everything that is wonderful about the city. So for the first edition, you can see this poster, we got about 85 walks for about 10 days. And in the second one, we got about 200 walks with 50 different partners across the city. And they were historians, artists, architects, food writers, etc. And this was really also to talk about how Delhi is massive and there's so much ground to cover. So several of those aspects also got covered, and we would at least looking at sort of newer areas. At the same time, we were exploring new content, such as this foraging walk or this blindfolded walk that we did with this person, which was led by a visually impaired person. And finally, like a big lesson in this was that things can start and end in completely sort of places that are unknown. And when we put two and two together based on what we find meaningful, really, like, there's a universe of opportunities and stuff starts to sort of line itself up. And as much as it's super scary to put anything out there in the world, in most cases we have very little to lose. The next project that I think was also pivotal in sort of thinking about this was called Art for Nepal. It's something I did in response to the Nepal earthquake in 2015. And that only happened because when I'd gone to Nepal in 2014 for work, I met these colleagues and I'd made these sketches. And by the time the earthquake happened, my colleagues went missing for about 4 days. And I just couldn't find a way to cope with the sense of loss that I felt. What I did in consequence, after they were found, they quickly started to build these transitional shelters. And while I wanted to help them, I felt like I could also use these sketches to do a fundraiser. So Art for Nepal was this fundraiser where I did these limited edition art prints that looked like this, and some postcards, which I would put together. I photographed them and I put them up on Facebook, really, and I tried to sell them. And I mean, there was a lot of detail because I enjoyed drawing and I wanted to do things by hand. So each of these postcards were hand stamped, hand signed. And what also happened is that 2 months later, my friends Lakshmi and Sarojini contacted me and said they wanted to also contribute. So Lakshmi ended up sort of steering this whole process of making these notebooks in Chennai with some of our drawings. And that became a very interesting incremental sort of step two. So all in all, over the course of about 6 to 8 months, we raised about 2.2 lakh rupees, with which we built 3 transitional homes. This was the first one that our colleagues in Nepal built. They're called SMA, and they're in Kathmandu. And this was the second one for which my friend Sarojini and I had the fortune to also travel to Nepal for. And this was around Christmas in 2015. What was really sort of heartbreaking was that this was also the time in 2015 when there was a massive blockade that India had put on Nepal, which meant that everything was super expensive. Now I'll explain this to you a little bit. So these homes are already transitional shelters, which meant that they were built from whatever was already available. So they were basically rebuilt from the rubble of the old home and then just bringing together whatever stone and mud was there. At the same time, I mean, little things like wood or the roof, etc., were bought. But what the blockade did was that it sort of blocked everything from petrol to gas to all sorts of tools, implements, and materials that were also used in building construction to Nepal, which meant that everything was almost like 1.5 to 2 times as expensive. So ultimately, it led to project costs sort of increasing. And while we were thinking we would build 3 homes, we were only able to build 2. While we intended to build 4, we could only build 3. And this made me realize that even though we all come together, these are my colleagues from SMA, this is Bikash Sai, this is Rumi, this is me, this is the couple we built this home for, this is Vijay and this is Sarojini. And while we have the best of the intentions, often what happens is that the real world does not pan out in the same way. That it takes much, much more than design and planning for things to really work out. There are things that are beyond our control, socio-economic, geopolitical forces that are constantly at play, right? And it is really about understanding all of those as well to frame our work better in order to make it more effective. So to learn more of this, I found myself at the LSE. So I went to the CITES program, which is called City Design and Social Science. It's a Masters of Science. And it's unique because it's multidisciplinary. And at the same time, it talks about how so much more, how cities are made with so much more than just design and planning. It's really about understanding the socio-economic and political sort of temperature of the region. The project I'm going to talk to you about was based in Thamesmead, and I did this with 4 of my colleagues. We were 3 architects, 1 sociologist, and an art curator. And the project was based in East London, where we were talking about this region, this social housing estate called Thamesmead, which was built in the 70s, and it was one of the largest social housing estates, which is like state-built housing for lower income to middle class people. And this was also the time when, while this was a massive sort of state project, this was also the time when the state itself was putting lots of pressure on building the idea of what poverty meant and how shameful it was to be poor. So we started to look at this, the development in this from the lens of territorial stigmatization, which is a theory which was which has been sort of talked about in the recent years, where basically people are discredited or devalued completely or only based on the place that they come from, and not so much based on their socio-economic or any other sort of condition. You saw this when Tony Blair gave this massive speech about poverty, but he sat right at this Aylesbury estate, which was this social housing estate, which was very recently again demolished because it was seen too unfit for accommodation. Uh, the big blow to this whole neighborhood came from this 1970s film called A Clockwork Orange, uh, which uh, which was a film that sort of was mainly this dystopic sort of imagination of these four men who just went around town beating the hell out of people. And it is this film that is often seen to be the the point where the whole neighborhood for the next few decades was seen to be like this shithole where like people really didn't live healthy lives and everything was unsafe and scary. In fact, Thamesmead is the neighborhood where presently the social credit score is the least in all of the UK. We started to unpack this from a spatial perspective as well, and we found out that it is happening so also because strategically the state seems to be demolishing all kinds of social amenities. So starting from the 2009, where you saw a pyramid club, which was like a social club being demolished, over the years, every other sort of marketplace or social club, etc., was demolished. And what we walked into was one of the final ones, which was the Dashwood, which was this blue box here. It was right next to the Peabody's office. All around it was ordinary sort of people living in social housing, and it seemed like a nice place in a neighborhood, you know. When we went there, we found like these two women who were really interesting and sort of ran the place, didn't have much to do with what was happening in the rest of London, and didn't know much about the redevelopment that was already ongoing. So we get here, and then in 2 weeks' time, they get a notice to evict the club because the developer said that this place, the social club, was unsafe for habitation. What we did was to then partner with a local nonprofit and talk about how, in the wake of this demolition, there could be a moment to actually celebrate everything that the Dashwood Social Club meant to its people. So we sort of organized this quick party for these people. It took about like 3 days to put together this event with this nonprofit and the club. And we had about 60 people show up. And it was bizarre that it was people who would, who were 70 years old and told us how it was really pivotal to how the time that like they were young, and how like lots of young people told us about how they've grown up in this club, which pointed us to that it was not just a place where people drank beer, but it really meant something very meaningful to this community. But at the same time, the state or the developer did not see this, and there was no way in which the community was able to communicate this to the state. So in response, we did something that is called the social return on investment. And this was really like a quick diagram and also a quick sort of analysis to understand what was the value that the club was bringing to the community just by the fact of being present there. What we did was to sort of enumerate this value for customers, for local residents, as well as for local businesses, and then really put like a pound figure to say, these are all the values that it brings, rather than just being this pub. And then we made this whole argument that it could be framed as an asset of community value, and then indeed be protected only in order to for the government to save money rather than spend more money on much more social benefit that they'll have to provide to all of these communities that will be deprived. And then we sort of made this sort of timeline to suggest how these interventions could be phased out in the short, medium, and long term. The project was a great lesson in realizing that often a lot of communities are just disempowered and they don't have the right language or means or tools to even understand what's happening to them, as well as tell stories to the structures of power. And what we could do as external sort of agents or designers is often only to find the right language to tell these better stories, ask better questions, and work towards effectiveness. Only because different tools or tactics work differently for different people. And cut to that, I found myself again really curious about this whole piece around telling better stories and asking better questions. And consequently, I joined Quicksand, which is a design strategy and innovation consultancy, which is based in India. And a lot of Quicksand's work revolves around the commercial sector, but a lot also around the development sector, where we do three basic things. We meet with people, we learn about their stories, we learn about where they come from, we tell stories about them, and finally we also craft experiences where some of these stories could be used for co-creation with partners or stakeholders. So the whole point of doing this is coming from a process called human-centered design, where in everything that you inquire about, you keep the human in the center and start looking at the framing of the world from the center, or from the human in the center. So while in the studio every day, we do a whole range of projects. In my everyday sort of thing, I've worked on sort of sexual and reproductive health. I recently worked on a project on the future of humanitarian work. We've also begun to grow like thinking and research towards urbanity, which is what is of interest to me and also a few others in the studio. So this is a new project that I'm sort of hosting. It's called Connected Cities, and it's really about speculating futures for people living in mid-sized Indian cities. So if you want to know more about this, you should write to me. Right. So in summary, these are three things that I think if you are listening to me and you're a young architect and designer or a student, it might be interesting to look at the world like this, I think. So I think it might be useful to see architecture as training rather than discipline. And it's something that or I have often felt really burdened about, where it felt like often a lot of people, or my mother asking me, what was this degree in architecture for if you don't build buildings anymore? And to realize that, and I guess she now sees this a little bit, that there's very little ways in which you can unlearn this design education. It's really become the way we look at the world now. When we look at streets, when we look at public infrastructure, there's no way we don't think about architects when we've trained in architecture. But at the same time, I think it's really useful to see architecture not as at the center of the universe, but as one integral part of it. I think it helps us really to work much, much better with other people, also to learn from them, because often I find people from the architecture or design communities to be on these high moral grounds and think that everyone's really like problematic, and the conditions are never right for them to design the best thing. But I think the conditions would never be right. We're always working in dynamic systems. And I think working like this can also help us rationalize the time, energy we spend on making work in any kind of way. And finally, it might be useful to see architecture or design as means to start and facilitate conversation. And this is something that I found myself doing starting from like when I was still in architecture school, and it's only become more and more pertinent now, where I've realized that everybody loves people who make things, and it's all right if you fail as long as you try. And more often than not, like two and two come together, and in many ways a lot of learnings just come back to us at the points that we really need them to be. So yeah, like if we keep our heart and head at the right place, like everything comes together in the end. So yeah, thank you. And I'd also love to thank Ethos and ASEDGE for having me think about my own work and also share it with you guys. So thank you.